It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. It is 7:12. And historian Stephen Arms is with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Doug.
And so you're going to fill us in on a few things like the first Thanksgiving.
Well, we'll talk about that. But I was thinking, I was listening to the show earlier, and I did want to, there were several questions that were asked about, and I said, well, I know the answers to these, so I thought I'd go in it.
Okay.
The driving issue one you were talking about, you're right, that if you're underage, if you're a teenager, and you get what they call an intermediate driver's license, you cannot operate a vehicle in Washington with other teenagers in it for the first 6 months.
So that's intermediate is what you get as your first license then? Well,
there's a training. You have a training permit, and then you have your intermediate license. And then after, unless you of course have somebody in their family who's an adult with you, and after 6 months you can only have 3 with you unless there's an adult with you. And I thought was really strange when I was thinking about it is that if you're a teenager, you can't operate a vehicle between 1 and 5 a.m. unless you have a driver in the vehicle with you who's 25 years or older. Which is a curfew in a sense. It is. It's a curfew, and it's saying that you have to. I doubt that's enforced.
Can you lose your license for that?
I know that it adds an additional penalty onto it, but I would but they did talk about suspension of license for violations because I looked this up when we were talking about it, and I said, so I mean you can there's warnings and then at more than one time that eventually it's suspension of the license entirely.
So I wonder what if you were like a soldier from Fort Lewis and you were 19 years old and you're out on the roadway at 2 a.m. in the morning. Are they going to bust you?
I think it would depend on how. I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. How mean the patrolman is. I guess technically they probably could, but I would really not want to. I wouldn't want to be the having to go to court with a judge looking at it and going, "This guy's getting back to base, and you're trying to bust him because he's driving home at after he's done." I mean that. But I guess theoretically. But
you're old enough to get shot, but you're not old enough to drive or drink or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of there's a lot of strange sanity on that. But you can lean the other direction on that though, because technically the way human brains develop, our brains do not fully reach their normal cognitive functional ability, where your emotion centers and your frontal lobes, your reasoning parts the reasoning becomes greater until you're 25 or more. So I mean it is strange that it's kind of funny. We idolize youth in a country where actually when you're that young, you're actually not quite in your right mind yet.
Well, I know when by the time I got out of basic and then went through my AIT, I didn't know where I was going to go. But the fact that I might be going to Vietnam, it was like, okay, that's part of the job, And now then I look at the documentary, and Ken Burns, and I'm thinking, whew. Holy smoke! What a place that was, and just by pure luck, I didn't go. But at the time, it was okay. You're young. You talk to people that have come back, so you're ready to go, in a sense.
But a lot of people don't know exactly. I mean, when you talk to vets, I have a lot of friends who are Vietnam vets. And, it's always different. When you're young, you still think you're invulnerable and you still think nothing's going to happen to you. And your life can be a horrible, it's a real horrible experience. I'm not saying it's bad. Military is a good thing for people, but.
I never thought I was invulnerable. It was just that, okay, you're a soldier, that's your job.
Well, I think maybe it's the difference better than a soldier. Maybe it's a better choice. If you're not a soldier, most teenagers think that they're they're not going to get hurt at all. And unfortunately, these days we're letting our people stay as teenagers probably till they're 30. In some cases, with families and keeping them on their insurance and all the different things.
Right.
So, but on your lighter side things, I was listening to your bull talk this morning.
Yes, bulls. Yes.
And there was a lot of bull in those early conversations. But you were talking about a couple of bulls that were locked horns in India. Brahma bulls are a sacred animal in India because they're symbol of the god Brahma. The other one actually is monkeys. Monkeys are sacred also in India because of they're symbols of the god Hanuman. And in the bull's case, it's not that big of a deal. But recently, they've had a problem since these monkeys are sacred and people feed them. They're becoming aggressive.
Yeah, I've seen videos of that.
There was actually someone was killed by one recently. Killed by monkey attacks in India. I think it was last week. I mean, that is like I said, monkeys are just human enough they can be dangerous.
Yes, because I think I told you the story about the monkey that somebody dropped off at KAST in Astoria.
No.
Somebody dropped the monkey off and opened the door, closed the door, but I couldn't see anything who it was because they kind of sneaked up. And so then I went around a certain way where they couldn't see exactly where I was going so I could get a view. There was nobody there. And then I went to the door, and there was no car parked there or anything like that. So then I go back. And I'm playing Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy by Elton John. and I'm typing up the log because we had a handwritten log we had to type. Stop. I turn around. There's a little monkey, a little tail on him. And he was putting his little hand on the record and then take it on, put it off. And so anyway, I went to grab him to get him off the record. And he leaped up on the curtains that were in the studio, then pooped in his hand, started throwing it at me. And I had to get the cops in there.
Everyone's a critic, I swear.
Yeah,
I mean, you just can't, that sounds like political discourse these days. Actually, you sure he wasn't? He was maybe.
No, he just didn't want. He didn't, to him. See, I was a foe, I guess.
I guess so, but it's like monkeys aren't cheap animals. Somebody had a very strange sense of humor. Did you ever find out who did it?
No, I think they wanted to get rid of him. Is what I think. And the radio station was where they chose.
Okay, because you're noted for your monkey business. All right, I got it. Okay, I get it now.
I never thought of that.
Well,
that's a good one.
Well, it's weak. It's. I thought about making a bull joke, but I want to be. It's probably too historical. But speaking of historical, like you said, since it's the day after Thanksgiving, I thought I had jotted down some notes, and on the first Thanksgiving, of course, we're talking about back in 1620. Vague in details. You have the Mayflower, of course, leaving England. It's 6 weeks passage across there. It's not an easy journey, and of course, most of the people are they're either looking for religious freedom, because again, the Church of England was limiting a lot of what we consider the early pilgrims. So they were different Protestant faiths that were going against the Church of England at the time, but also because of just land opportunities. I mean, the New World was said to be thought of as it's an empty continent. And so they make the journey, and it's not an easy journey by any means. And when they first get there, I mean, people don't realize that for the first 6 months they actually stayed on board the ships because they'd gotten there toward the winter season.
Oh, okay.
It was cold.
So the weather was bad. Yeah.
And then of course, and also they had nowhere to go. I mean, you can build things. You have to build actual structures against you, because we're talking about Massachusetts. We're talking about when you're talking about going down to the Mayflower is, you're talking about you need to, but the problem with staying on board the ship was scurvy and disease. And so, I mean, there were about half the, population was wiped out in the beginning. So when they finally come to shore, they're greeted, of course, by the locals, and the local are the Abnaki Indians. And it was funny because they actually greeted them in English, because there's that other story. Most people have heard the story of Squanto. Mm-hmm. Squanto was a member of the Abnaki tribe who had been captured by I mean, the Pilgrims aren't the first one that came to the New World, and he was taken back to England as a slave, and eventually was able to come back in another mission. But he had learned to speak English while he was there, and he's the reason why they survived, because it's Squanto is the one who he told them, he helped them form up an alliance with the large local tribe, which was the Wampanoag. And then he ends up, and he taught them, okay, this is a poisonous plant. Here's how you catch fish in these rivers. This is what you look for to eat. These are the different animals. He taught them about, how to cultivate corn, how to get, syrup out of maple trees, things that just weren't, they didn't know how to do. And they probably wouldn't have survived if it hadn't been for
George, if he knew what was going to happen to his country, he probably would have told him, "Go to hell."
Well, it's funny. I mean, people like go back and look at that. But for example, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had a treaty that lasted for over 50 years. I mean, they didn't have any problems at all with each other in the beginning,
in the early
stages. And matter of fact, and that's where you end up with Thanksgiving, because you end up, it's very common in European traditions and all over the world. You have harvest festivals, and generally you have feasts because you've got food. And what ended up happening, of course, in 1621, the governors William Bradford, and they decided to have a feast, and it was their first thing.
KBKW's Coffee Talk at 7:23. Stephen Arms, historian, is our guest today, and we're talking about the first Thanksgiving and then what transpired after that.
Well, we got to, I think I was left off the point where we're about ready to, they've had their first corn harvest because, again, they were told, taught by the natives, particularly by Squanto, how to actually be able to survive. And so they decided they're going to have a celebratory feast, and Governor William Bradford, who was in charge of the area, he was William Bradford at the time, he eventually became governor. They invited members of the Wampanoags, and their chief is Maciote. And he came along with about 80 of his men. And the first Thanksgiving, most people, they think, well, Thanksgiving dinner. No, it was a 3-day Thanksgiving party because the Wampanoags came with like 5 deer themselves. And what we generally think about, since they had long since ran out of sugar, I mean, there wasn't going to be a lot of pies or any of that type of stuff that people want to think about. So they're probably eating more conventional, seasoned in Indian, what would be considered the native ways of spices of how to make the
How do they sweeten things in? Honey?
Honey could be honey, and there's some sweetness in maple, but it's not as sweet as people think it is. But I thought it was really interesting that they're really, and it was fairly peaceful. I mean, there wasn't any they had a nice party, and everybody, like I said, they'd formed a treaty that had lasted the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims lasted for over 50 years. And again, more people came in. Eventually, you're going to have incursions on land, and that's when treaties fall apart, unfortunately. But what's interesting, people that one of the things that the Pilgrims would have eaten that is, our first, Thanksgiving, lobsters probably were there because there's plenty of lobster in the area. The Americans at the time and the natives ate seals, and which is, people don't really think about that now as being edible. And the other one is swans. Swans are considered a delicacy because they're basically they're just a big duck when you get right down to it. I mean, they're duck with attitude. Have you ever dealt with swans? I mean, their wings are, they're aggressive. Their wings can hit you hard enough to break bone. I
used to have to deal with had a lot of geese at Green Lake. Yeah, but, and as a little kid, I remember getting bit. And of course, just no teeth, but
chased around. Yeah, they're but the swans are really kind of aggressive animals. Anyways, I just thought it was an interesting, this is just the general idea of it. But what most people don't realize about it is that the Thanksgiving was celebrated around the country generally in November, but it didn't become a national holiday until FDR. It was Franklin Roosevelt was the one.
So what were they doing before then? Was people have Thanksgiving? They didn't call it that? Or?
It was state holidays. They would have Thanksgiving holidays by states, and they'd be different days of the year.
Oh, okay.
Lincoln, during the Civil War, was the first time that a president actually declared a day of Thanksgiving right in the middle of the Civil War in 1861. In 1862. And because, again, he was trying to pull together, the idea that nations, that even though it's a horrible time, we have as Americans have things to be thankful for. But again, it doesn't become for real until FDR sits down and again, right during the Depression, and it was, again, more of a thing to pull people together and encourage people for the future. So it isn't, it isn't like we've had it, since the 1600s, but it didn't become official until the 1930s. So I think that's pretty much my Thanksgiving things that I thought for today. But I thought people might be interested in it. I mean, most people are probably on turkey overdose today and eating, laying around still, unless they have to work. I mean,
the traffic was down a little bit, although I'm sure there's probably people around here, doing the Black Friday routine.
Oh yeah, I was looking at that stores opening. Even I'm 5 a.m. way too early to be trying to get out and about in the world at that point. I never quite understood that, but again,
what you mean? Everybody going out shopping?
Yeah, well, just the I don't mind the idea of getting. I'm a thrifty fellow. I don't mind saving my money and using it well. But the idea of the violence that ends up occurring and the nastiness that people do, to get one stupid plasma TV or something.
And usually it's a special one. It's not made up to the specs of the one that they think they're getting.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Or they only have 4 of them.
Right.
Right. So, and then people come in and then, and we've had, of course, we'll see what the end of the news day today, if we have any casualties, but there'll be some injuries, I'm sure. Hopefully no fatalities.
Because what's interesting, the average television is designed to last a flat screen 30,000 hours, and if you get more than that, but you're pushing your luck.
Right.
And some of the sets that you can get that might even be a brand name may be good for only 20,000 or 15,000 hours of service. So they use it's cheaper, but you don't know that until you get it home, and then after 3 or 4 years, it's toast.
And people are just. It's the time of year. So I understand. I did a whole article piece, matter of fact, in the Senior Sunset Times, that when it comes out in December, I did a little bit on the some of the pagan traditions of Europe that were that stay over in Christmas today. And the gift giving and all that's part of ancient tradition. But it'll make for it's an interesting read. I'd recommend people. We'll talk about next time on. We'll talk about Christmas.
Okay, sounds good. It is 7:29, and Stephen Arms is our guest, and we'll be back with him. And your calls are welcome once we're out of our break at 360-533-5259. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. It is 7:37. Historian Stephen Arms is our guest today. So what are some other areas you want to delve into this half hour?
Well, let's see. I was listening to the news break there, and they were talking a little about the situation on the southern border with the caravans coming forward and being in Tijuana and all that. I mean, that's definitely an interest of an issue of some contention, and I personally the weird part about it is that you've had a judge in San Francisco who has ruled that the administration does not have the power to actually regulate those people coming in, and that's categorically not the case. I mean, it's the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, and there was revisions on it in 1965, which tells you the fact that we obviously need it because it's literally 1960 since we've actually done serious immigration work in this country. But that specifically, the Supreme Court, at the time and what was established in the law is that the President of the United States that immigration is an issue of national security, and that the President does have a right to limit people for the time they wish to, and it's pretty much just the time the way the law is designed. If they think there's issues of public safety, issues of health, issues of national security. I mean, people may not like it, but I mean, it's the same power that every president has had since this point. And they can set quotas, they can restrict it on. Now there are restrictions on whether or not you can restrict them based solely on certain factors. There are some issues in the 65 law. It mentions that it can't be done for racial or religious reasons, but a country in general can be restricted. And again, talking about this, what we're talking about here is illegal immigrants. It's obviously an issue of security because you don't know who they are. I mean, you have to know who you're allowing in. I mean,
but a lot of this is they've been invited in by people that use them for employees.
Well, that's what it is, and
businesses.
And I agree. That's one of the immigration is a complicated issue. But I always know the first thing I know if a person's serious about making reform on it is, are you willing to penalize the employers that hire illegals? Because rest assured, if a company had to pay $50,000 fee every time an illegal they found was hired, no one would hire illegals. And if you don't have a market, they're not going to come. But I mean, these people, like these individuals they're putting themselves in danger. The weird part about these caravans is that, one, how do you travel 1,000 miles without having some form of support system when there's again thousands of people traveling? Obviously, there's money coming into there. There's resources coming into it. You couldn't have done it. And seeking, according to international law, there are different laws that define what people are based on refugees. And seeking a better financial life does not make you a refugee.
Right, but not everybody. But some of these people are actually in fear of their lives.
They are, but then but the thing about it is, and that's why all of them have to be checked over independently. I mean, that you have to go through a processing system. The answer, what they're hoping for, is that they're going to come across and they're going to just have to catch
overwhelm the system
and catch and release them.
Yeah.
And the problem is, I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to have to go through and get judges, and they're going to be going through this, as they should. Because if you're just here because I want to, do I have a right to go to a rich person's house and say I'm going to come and use your stuff? I'll clean around the house and I'll work and I'll do things, but then I get to use your $25 million facilities rather than my poor little house that just got evaluated. It did go up in value though. That's something. Of course, means my taxes are going to go up too. I mean, you do need to have people think about this as immigration is a country has to have borders, and if you allow caravans to come in this country and not be restrained, then you are taking away the decision-making process on how law works. You're not saying that we regulate our borders and our laws tell who we can have and who we cannot have come in, and you're allowing strangers, in essence, to make choices on that. And I'm absolutely sure, you can make arguments about these groups of people, but if you have 5,000 people, there's going to be a percentage of them that are hardened criminals. There's going to be a percentage of them that are gangbangers. There's going to be a percentage of them that are human traffickers. It's the law of average. Are all of them that way? Of course not.
I think the president exaggerates the danger of it, but I think that's the part of that's political. But there, obviously there probably is. But I think that his version of what the numbers are off.
But I mean, I haven't heard any specific facts on the actual numbers. But it's a matter of what are you willing to call a reasonable amount? How many hundred are you willing to let in, and how many? I know that the statistical information when you're dealing with human trafficking, I did some research on this and looked it over. That it comes out to about of illegals coming in the country about 5%, up to as high as 8% are directly human trafficking. So if I've got 1,000
out of the 100,
out of 100, well, but but if I have 1,000 people, all of a sudden, how many people are you willing to come and live in virtual slavery? How many children are you going to let come and be part of gangs and drug running and prostitution and the things that happen with that? How many are you willing to let? Is it okay are you content to let in 100 people in the country if you know that 5 of them are going to be young people that are going to end up in as human trafficked? That strikes me as a number I don't think I'd be wanting to play if it was mine. And when you multiply that up, obviously, if suddenly it's 1,000, now it's
of course, the numbers we're talking about are pale to stuff that Europe has had to put up with.
Europe is having huge issues on that.
Thousands of people,
and Europe is having some significant issues on that because of
absolutely.
It. Well, I mean, the most significant thing that happened is in Germany. Of course, Germany allowed a massive influx in from the Middle East. About 2 million.
And Merkel's pretty much had it.
Merkel hasn't pretty much had it. Merkel has lost control. Her party lost control, and she's done it the first of the year. She's announced her resignation, which is probably.
I don't blame her. Would you want the job after? Well, I mean, she's been in there a long time.
But honestly speaking, she's also the one who's caused a lot of the trouble. I mean, Merkel is allowed her policies. If her country's having issues about not dealing with an incredible amount. Anytime you bring in a massive influx of people into a nation, and the problem is that what do you want them to do? Do you want them to sectionalize out and become little individual ghettos, little individual communities that don't even talk to each other? And again, that's an issue sometimes when you start looking at the Middle East and Africa specifically. You have people that are right next to each other that may be immigrants coming into your country. They're fleeing war zones. It doesn't mean they don't hate each other too. You end up with areas where people will settle together, and you'll have people another that are still fighting. They're bringing their problems with them, because if you allow them to stay entirely as a homogenous culture, I mean, when people come into a country and want to actually honor their culture and be part of a new nation, which is again what most of our parents did. I mean, my family are Irish, and the Irish came here. My family came here from during the potato famine.
Yeah, so did my mother's side.
Yeah. So I mean, you've got a true issue of refugee because people are actually starving to death, under circumstances where there really wasn't any choice on it. But they came here and they worked, and they eventually moved in and assimilated into the culture.
And we had to change our last name, too. It was O'Harity.
O'Harity?
Dropped the O.
Yeah, people don't understand that either. That that there, the no Irish apply was a sign that you saw a lot in this country. And I've always there's a famous story from a historian during the right before the Civil War that he's talking about he's looking at a riverboat being loaded, and he's in the South, and on the top of the dock are all a row of black men, and on the boat are all a bunch of pale men. And what it is the boats come down from the north, and it has Irish workers on it. And then it has, of course, slaves. And they're pushing down the 200-pound bales of hay, sliding them down, catching them on the boat. And he asked the captain at one point, why are they so, separate? He goes, wouldn't you think they could work together? He goes, we don't put the slaves down for catching the bales. The catching those bales, a man can be killed. He goes, a slave costs money. He goes, I can always get another Irishman.
Jeez.
It's a matter of, people don't understand that. Well,
it had nothing to do with skin color. It just had to do with,
they were Irishmen. As long as they had something.
Now, what if you were from Scotland? Were you okay then? You're from Scotland. That's okay.
Well, we didn't get a lot of. You ended up with some of the Scotch Irish, of course, in the northern, but they didn't come in the levels in the cities that the Irish did.
Well, because the McDowells, which is Scotch, came to the country in 1670.
Wow,
something like that. So that my father's side had been here for years. My mom's side came in after the famine.
Came in later.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, history. Oftentimes, people like people want it to be one way or the other. And there are several rules I always have in dealing with history. One of them is you always have to judge history by its time. We cannot look back on history now and say, well, our morality now says it's this, and it's not the case back then. I mean, again, this back to our Pilgrims, story. They came to an area, and think about if you sailed in 1620 in the East Coast in the United States, if you could even see smoke, it would be an amazing thing, because there were so few people in the ratio of how much of the land is, because the natives kept a very small population. I mean, for them, that continent was empty.
Did they ever figure out what the population of America was?
North and south, or
well, states, just the continental United States, just to what the size was before.
There are different opinions on it. Depends on whether you're going to add Mesoamerica into it. I know if you put Mesoamerica into it,
Meso is
meaning above Mexico as part of it too.
Oh, okay.
Because you do have.
Well, Mexico used to own part of this country.
Well, but then we're going to put in the Aztecs and the Olmecs and the Toltecs as far as native tribes. I've heard as about 27 million for the continent is probably about accurate. I've heard as much as 65, but I have a tendency of thinking I'd lean it probably around 30 million. I mean, there were no
about the size of the population of Canada then?
Probably.
Isn't Canada
scattered over the entirety of Mexico to again, you're talking about Algonquin peoples in the east, and your.
How far north? All the way up through to Canada?
Through Alaska.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
That's in a calculation. But of course, and you think about that's a horrible. Well, because I know that when the census was taken in the United States in 1870, the Native American population was around 700,000.
By that time. Boy, they've been reduced a lot.
Well, and again, and one killer specifically, people always want to say it isn't bullets that killed the native peoples; it was disease. I mean, when you have large concentrations of people, cities in Europe, you get flus and influenzas, and you get smallpox, and even chickenpox. Chickenpox now is the thing, but back then it'd be lethal. And people came over with strains of disease the natives had no resistances to. And it wiped out. That's what 99% of your death comes simply from disease, because there wasn't any immunity to it. There's some indication. There was a few diseases that passed the other way back, but most of them weren't lethal, because again, not the concentration of people to have those diseases change and mutate the way they do now. And if you took a person who had the flu now and took them back into say the 1600s and dropped them in a city, you'd end up with a pandemic. Because the strains we have now have changed and mutated millions and millions of times so much, they might
their immune system wouldn't recognize it.
On the other hand, there are diseases there we may not recognize either, and the food would kill us for sure, because the food that people ate in, when you talk about like our Pilgrim Feast idea, hanging the bird for a day or two ripens it up nicely to be cooked. We don't think about that now, that you just hang a bird for a day.
Well, they do that with deer. They'll hang deer for a while.
And deer will hang for a while once you've drained out the blood and everything. But there are people who, they like a gamey flavor. When they talked about a gamey flavor in fowl back in the 1600s, we're talking just this side of spoiled. And the people now would end up dying of, would die of just consuming the food.
So people back then had a resistance to.
They had a resistance for food. And other thing, but diseases, again, like I said, our diseases have changed just simply with population. One of the things we're going to deal out in the world in general, since people move around so quickly across the globe, that a strain of disease in the United States ends up in India, or a strain of disease from, Africa ends up in South America, and the people may not have an immunity to it at all because it's a different strain. One of the issues on dealing with immigration issues is there's been an uprise in dengue fever in the United States in the southern areas.
Now, what is that?
Dengue fever is a particularly nasty and potentially lethal fever that comes out of Africa. But because you get people migrating through from Africa into South America into North America, there's actually an increase of it that's occurring now. It's mostly in Eastern Africa.
Interesting. Well, it is 7:52. We're going to take a break and then be right back. It's KBKW's Coffee Talk. It is 7:54. Stephen Arms is with us. And we have about 5 minutes left.
So, how are things, Doug?
Things are going well.
Yeah, when you have 5 minutes, it's not like you want to delve into an entirely new, topic of incredible complexity. Yeah, I was just, it is interesting, though, that when you're looking at the world, the world is a dangerous place, and that's one of the reasons. Again, talking about immigration is, again, America is the most. It allows more immigration than any nation in the world, legal immigration than any nation in the world. And I personally have, because I know a lot of people who immigrated here legally into this country, and I would take great offense if I had to spend the 10 years it takes to become a legal citizen in this country, and just saying that somebody else can just jump through the line and go fiddly-dee.
But don't you think 10 years is a long time as well?
It is kind of a long time. But I mean, again, when people in the past, there's a difference. When people came in the past, again, let's go back to the people at Ellis Island. Talking about some of the Irish, and it took a long time. They checked you over very carefully. They literally, when people came into people don't think at Ellis Island. Ellis Island had medical facilities. They looked you over for disease, and if they found any indications that you had something that they didn't, they put you back on the boat and sent you back.
Now, we went through Ellis Island when they reopened it, for because it's a museum now. But,
right, of course.
But yeah, you can. But it to me, it looked very crude, and by today's standards, you'd want something much more modern.
You would, but I mean, again, like I said, judge history by its time.
Right.
Medicine at that time was crude. I mean, again, when you're talking about the potato famine was 1847. If you're talking about the Irish coming into America in 1850, they weren't 100% sure how diseases were still being passed at that point. A lot of the germ theory was at that point just a theory back then. I mean, people don't understand that, we know these things now, and in knowing them doesn't mean that you should be less careful. And again, most countries in the world only allow people to migrate into the nation by merit-based systems. I mean, you and I, like I said, we can't go to Canada. I was talking to my friend who lives in Japan yesterday, and he's married to a Japanese lady, and he's been there for 20 years, and he still renews his visas every 2 years. Or he accidentally missed one time and spent the night in jail.
Well, the Japanese aren't real high on immigration anyway.
In general, yeah. and he is, of course, an Americanese. He's or the gaijin, as the case would be called.
I heard that the Japanese, the entire country is threatened because of the shrinkage of the number of people that live there, and the elderly are expanding, and the young people following their footsteps is shrinking.
Well, the problem is they're a zero growth population country. They generally only have enough many children as they have actually
My understanding is less now.
Well, it is, and the United States technically is that too, which is why legal immigration in the country is a wonderful idea, and you can get a robust change in doing it. But if you don't regulate the borders of a nation, you don't have a nation. I mean, you cannot just open up and allow any. I mean, how many people who want a better life is America going to absorb? There's a billion. I'm pretty confident I could gather a billion up around the world pretty easily and come to here, which would only put us that one. Then we'd have more people than China. So I guess the issue is difficult, but it isn't. But it has to be dealt with rationally. It shouldn't be dealt with because rich people need people to work with them, or political parties need constituents to vote for them. It should be, they're not acting in the best interest of the nation. They're acting in their own personal interest. And again, we have a split government now. Let's see if they can actually do something together, because I think immigration reform is something they're going to have to work on with this new Congress.
They've been kicking it down the
but I think they're coming to a point they're really going to have to do something about it. I mean, I do think this is an issue that this administration would like to tackle. Infrastructure is another one, obviously, and I think use carrot and sticks on that. You give your infrastructure things to get people to side on something dealing with immigration, because unfortunately, in the dealing with Congress, if you don't entice them to do things, they're likely to sit there and do nothing and just complain.
But also, I think that the nation too, or the federal government, should put pressure on the pharmaceutical companies and some of the healthcare facilities to figure out a way to make sure that people that live in rural areas have the same kind of health care as people that live in the city. Which is
good. There's a basic level of health care I would agree with that the government should help people to acquire.
Yeah, and even if that means having some sort of system where doctors would be required to be in a rural area for a certain amount of time, and then they would get free education,
free tuition. That's a good way to do it. There are programs that are like that.
If you wish to join the quest for knowledge, the battle for truth, please hit the like button, recommend my channel to others, and of course, subscribe. Thank you kindly.